الاسم ده والصغيرين منا ما يعرفوهاش، لكن النهارده يعني يعرفوا عنها بعض المعلومات والإسهامات على مستوى القسم وعلى مستوى الدولة الحقيقة. فأنا مش هتكلم، أنا هسيب الفرصة للناس إذا هتتكلم. والدكتورة هدى الصدى بتضخم فيها بعد في مانشستر، وبتقول لها إنه يسعدنا إنها تقول المحاضرة هتبقى جزء من تقديم احتارنا كتير نبتدي بالدكتورة هدى الصدى ولا نبتدي المتحدثين المختلفين اللي هيتكلموا على الدكتور عبد. وفي النهاية اتفقنا الدكتورة هدى الجندي هتبتدي، الدكتورة هدى الصدى هتقول لنا المحاضرة بتاعتها، وبعدين اتفضل الدكتور ماهر، الدكتورة أمية، الدكتورة سيسي، الدكتورة سلوى الجندي، والدكتورة لبنى عبد. سلوى السؤال أحسن، عايزين سلمت عليك.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry about this. This is my fault entirely because I've shifted everything around and I shifted everybody around with me, and so I apologize to start off with. I also want to say, I don't want to take long, but this is a sort of joint venture of the Indies, because Nadia is not here, and she gave me something to say, and I have something to say as well. And you can hear me without the microphone. Okay, I'm going to start with Nadia. This is what she wanted me to say. My brief claim to fame was ironically on one of the worst days of my life, the day of my final for the PhD. When on the dais of room 13, exactly here, I faced 4 formidable women, professors Angel, Fatma, Latifa Zayyad, and Eva Sai. Interestingly enough, I don't know why she had 4, but I think this must be unique. I've never heard of anybody having 4. Sorry? She was interested in yes, but she said that. But why 2? Why 2 external examiners? I don't know. But anyway, we won't go to that. For those of you, of course, who don't know, I mean, most of you will have heard, of course, of Dr. Angel and Fatma, but also Latifa Zayyad, I'm sure. But another very formidable woman was Eva Sayan, and then Drs. Latifa and Eva were from the Women's College. She goes on to say, these were women who were pioneers in the fields of education and business. In retrospect, she says, however, this was my proudest academic moment. For these 4 legendary women made an indelible mark on the history of academia and on me. She goes on to say, I'm eternally grateful to Dr. Angel, who stuck her neck out for me by becoming a co-supervisor, and Dr. Fatma had to leave for Sardinia. At that time, co-supervision was fairly new, and was, I suppose, a difficult position, because it was undefined. Really, what was a co-supervisor supposed to do? Was it purely nominal, or should it be more than that? In the event, Dr. Angel carried out the duty or non-duty in an exemplary fashion, never interfering, but constantly encouraging, chatting to me, urging me to continue, and never allowing me to despair. On that terrible day of arrival, I kept my eyes on Dr. Angel, and I saw that she was furthering her role as encourager, smiling and nodding approvingly as I stammered and stuttered through my answers. On that day, she was my rock, and I am eternally grateful. That's that. and then a junior colleague, as some of us here are also. Dedicated and devoted are the words that come to mind when I think of Dr. Angel. When I was a student, we knew we could always depend on her turning up for her classes, sometimes to our sorrow, I can say. You know, when as students, you're always waiting for the teacher not to turn up. Or at least we did. And consequently, I believe we also turned up, as though there was a feeling that since she was always there, maybe even out of courtesy, we also ought to be there. One particular incident that stands out in my mind, and that is in a section class, which was an essay class. We were waiting for our teacher, who was not on there. We were waiting on tenterhooks because she was late. And I don't know if we still do this, but we used to wait for half an hour. And if the teacher didn't turn up, we were out. And so we were waiting on tenterhooks, sitting, I have to say, on top of the benches, not on the seats. Clutching our books to ourselves, ready for the clock to strike half the hour so we get out the door. Just as the clock was about to strike, it walked Dr. Angel. She was not our regular teacher, and so we thought perhaps she's just going to come and say that our teacher was not able to come and to let us out, to our dismay. And I have to say, with groans all round, Dr. Angel fixed us with her eyes, told us to sit properly, take our paper and pen, thoughtful of all things to write a lesson. But what was really most remarkable, not only that she took upon herself to do that, she actually mocked. Then, what I also particularly appreciated when I became a junior colleague was her understanding of, putting this in quotes, the worth of a woman. She was never, again in quotes, a card-carrying feminist. But she never, ever demeaned the role of women by kowtowing to or being afraid to express her opinion in the face of the majority of men, whether in the faculty, council, or later on in the shore. Her air of quiet authority impressed me greatly when I saw her as head of control, the worst again possible face, being on control, to be anything, that seems to be comprised of belligerent men, whom I didn't know I was then a junior colleague, and they were belligerent, and they were all men. She was the head of control, but she had her with dignity, with quietness. She kept them in control. Just lastly, Dr. Angel always did the duty, over and above for the duty. And all I can say is thank you. And thank you.
Thank you, Professor El-Gindi, and I invite Professor El-Sadda to give us her talk.
I'm really honored to be asked to do this talk on this occasion. It's a special occasion and I'm very happy to participate. My talk is actually based on a book that's coming out in 2 weeks, so I have to say, inshallah, in 2 weeks, this is something that's going to materialize very soon. The title is Gender, Nation and the Canon of the Arab Novel. And what I try to do in this talk and in the book is ask the question, what are the implications for the canon of the Arabic novel if gender is a category of analysis? Now, I use canon, the word canon, to mean literary, the sum total of literary works that are deemed most central, most representative, or most important in a particular culture, in a particular period, or in a particular genre. To And this engagement with the national canon of Arabic literature from a gender lens is grounded in two basic assumptions. The first is that the canon of Arabic literature, particularly the novelistic canon, I will talk about this, both reflects and constructs the ideas of nation and national identity in the modern period. The second is that the nation is an imagined community, as an imagined community according to Anderson, is gender, and by extension, the canon is equally gendered. I use the concept of gender as defined by Joan Scott, and she says it is a constitutive element of social relationships based on perceived differences between the sexes and as a primary way of signifying relations of power. Now, to explore the gendered nature of the literary canon, I examined representations of femininity and masculinity in modern Arabic fiction. These representations of ideal gender roles and characteristics define and shape the contours of national identity and national futures. But there are also cultural interventions in ideological contestations over the image of the nation. And of course, the same processes are still happening until this minute, right? So if you follow debates on personal status laws, the sitting, the whole ILO, and so on in our distinguished parliament, these are all battles over identity, and gender is at the heart of these battles. I argue that conflicting representations of gender roles shape and correspond to conflicting political ideologies. Regarding, in particular, as I focus here on the modernity versus tradition paradigm for explicating the modern history of the Arab world. Briefly, during the Nahda period, turn of the century, the 20th century, we find that there was a male Nahda elite that dominated the field of literary production, and they shaped the nation in their own image, foregrounding their values, their ontological dilemmas, their fears and desires, their historical choice was in favor of a rupture with tradition as a condition for entry to modernity, and consequently internalized many of the assumptions of colonial discourse that instituted a value-laden binarism between the traditional and the modern. Inevitably, as a consequence of their dominance in the cultural field, other imaginings of the nation, other discourses that had once enjoyed credence and wide circulation, and audiences were marginalized. So going back to the modern Arabic tradition and revisiting it from a gender lens, will interrogate this process of inclusion and exclusion, who gets included in the canon, who gets excluded. These are all processes that are related to the whole project of nation building. Also, this project perhaps will lead to a recovery of literary voices that have been marginalized. Yeah. So maybe I can just, I'm not loud enough. Alright, so what I'm doing in this talk, I divided it into three parts. I will answer the question, why am I saying that the novelistic canon is an important sign for understanding the process of nation building to begin with? And then I will shed light or examine the three literary debates in the Arabic tradition that are indicative of processes of inclusion and exclusion, as I just described. The first is the debate about what counts as the first Arabic novel. We've all heard about Zainab as the first Arabic novel. There's a debate around this, and I will look at it as indicative of this process of inclusion and exclusion. And then I will look at two debates that happened in the 1990s, and they were about the literary production of a new generation of writers, the new writing. Okay, so the first part. The rise and development of the modern Arabic novel ran parallel to and intersected with projects of nation building in the modern period. Now, this is not unique to the Arabic tradition. Homi Baba, for example, has drawn attention to the centrality of narrative in the construction of national imaginaries and asserted that nations are the nations. Benedict Anderson privileged the novel in particular as a site for the construction of nations or imagined communities. And El-Sadda also emphasized the role of fictional narratives, particularly the novel, as a sign of colonial cultural representations in the service of empire, and as a locus for resistance to anti-colonial nationalisms. Now, the novel as a modern genre became one of the main venues for shaping the contours of the national imaginary, hence a contested site for competing ideologies and actors. But it also became a critical site for the interpretation and analysis of national themes and directions. Now, recent critiques of Arab modernity have highlighted how the Arab literary establishment assimilated a Western modernist paradigm, resulting in the trivialization of traditional or popular forms of knowledge, and an acceptance of the superiority of the European forms of cultural production. Consequently, the rise of novelism, as it is called in Western culture, or the institutionalization of the novel as the characteristic expression of Western modernity and quoting, also became a measure of the attainment of modernity and modern writing in both Arabic and Persian literatures, for example, as has been argued by authors. At the same time, the privilege of the novel as the modern genre par excellence and the manifestation of the modern spirit resulted in the marginalization of other genres and forms of cultural expression. Now, but still, even though there are these critiques of why privilege the novel remains a privileged site because of the status it has been accorded in cultural history. And we can still look at it as a very good place to understand these processes of inclusion and exclusion. Literary canons are invariably linked to ideas of nationhood. And I'd just like to go into it outside Arabic literature for a minute. In The Rise of English, Terry Eaton tells the story of how English literature rose to power on the back of wartime nationalism. He argues that it was only after the First World War that English was transformed from, I quote, the subject fit for women, workers, and those wishing to impress the natives, unquote, to a serious intellectual pursuit for students at Oxford and Cambridge. And then later, why this one happened has subsequently traced the beginnings of English literary studies to colonial India, where the study of English classics was an essential component in the cultural domination and politics of empire. It follows that the canon of English literature performed a dual role, depending on different geographical and historical contexts. In post-World War England, it bolstered the national sense of identity at a time of crisis, while in the colonies, it was a hegemonic weapon to control the minds and hearts of Indian colonial subjects, ensuring their subjugation to English values and culture. Literary canons are therefore cultural products shaped by and constituted of the geopolitics of cultural production at a given historical moment. They can simultaneously legitimize projects of conquest and domination as well as projects of resistance and liberation. Now, to go back to the linguistic canon of Arabic literature, this has largely been constructed to reflect and comply with the nationalist agenda, hence expressing dominant themes in national discourses and excluding other equally important themes expressed by more marginal voices and groups. Canonical novels written in the first half of the 20th century that are anthologized and celebrated as expressive of Arab worldviews and concerns will inevitably address issues related to the dilemma of the protagonist, an Arab intellectual usually, who's torn apart between tradition and modernity, the relationship between East and West, the individual and society, the woman question, all themes that occupy a central place in the national discourse. If you think of all the early classics, this actually applies. These are the themes that dominated the canon in the first decades of the 20th century. The 50s saw the rise of what is known as written literature, or Arabic. Influenced by Jean-Paul Sartre's What is Literature and the political turmoil in the region, the gained their critical sharpness from a burning desire to change the world. Now, the 70s and 80s, obviously rushing, and it witnessed a sweeping wave of disillusionment which created a new mood in literature that has been described as the new sensibility, where the protagonist is no longer certain of his or her ability to decipher the outside world and resorts to techniques and artistic strategies to help him or her portray an enigmatic world. Still writing about masculine identity in fiction of the Arab East, Samira Agassi and Botiker qualifies the novels analyzed in the study as possessing and quoting an underlying political awareness revealing the centrality of political life and the precedence of collective over private issues. And finally, one critic, Maher, says that one of the things that distinguishes, in fact, Arab modernism from Western modernism is political engagement.
دكتور هدى الورقة مغطية وشك.
So, the consensus remains that even the most personal individual traumas are necessarily symbolic at some level of collective traumas and predicaments. That too much involvement in one's life on the part of writers is tantamount to betrayal, especially in situations of conflict. Now, I'd like to again link this to something said by, to a famous statement by Frederick Jameson, actually a controversial thesis, that all third world texts are necessarily national allegories. This is a quote from Jameson. That they're always imbued with the political. Now, this has been critiqued by many. So Ajaz Ahmed, for example, to give just one prominent example, argued that Jameson's theory of cognitive aesthetics of third world literature essentializes differences between civilizations, homogenizes diverse histories and trajectories of development, and more importantly, reduces third world history and social dynamics to one experience, namely the experience of colonialism and imperialism. After demonstrating that not all third world texts need to be read as national allegories, Ahmed wonders if Jameson's hypothesis institutes the law of the father, that only those texts which give us national allegories can be admitted as authentic texts of third world literature, while the rest are excluded by definition. Now, Ahmed's law of the father refers to theoretical paradigms constructed by first world critics for inclusion of works in the universal Western canon. So, if we go back to the canon of Arabic literature or the Arab critical establishment, I actually argue that this establishment, the Arab critical establishment, has accepted the basic premise of Jameson's thesis that third world literatures, Arab literature, are defined by colonial and anti-colonial experience and privileging nationalist dimension in artistic expression. The main point here is that this canonical dictum is not self-evident or necessarily reflective of existing Arab cultural production, but is inevitably contingent on processes of inclusion and exclusion, as I've argued, where we find that works that do not fit the nationalist criteria are marginalized or undermined or deemed unworthy. Ahmed also has noted that Jameson's text is gendered, that it could not have been written by a US woman, for example, given that the tradition of feminists who persistently challenge the opposition between the private and the public, given the tradition of feminists who persistently challenge the opposition between the private and the public realms. In effect, the pronounced nationalist character of the canon has resulted in the marginalization of cultural production that did not subscribe directly to the national edicts and has also inhibited the voices of both men. I move now to the first debate that I think is indicative of the good debate about what counts as canonical. Now, a very good example of this canonical literary text has been the focus of many revisionist readings and interpretations, and I'm talking about Muhammad Hikkel's novel Zainab. Until the last decade of the 20th century, the widespread consensus amongst literary historians has been that Zainab is the first Arabic novel. This is despite the fact that many before Zainab's appearance in 1914. Now, arguments for why Zainab has been accorded prominence in the canon vary. It's always discussed, but they mostly focus on technical issues. Then it is more artistically mature compared to earlier experiments. And this is something that is upheld by Abdul Nasser, for example, who constructs a typology for the development of the genre and divides the novelistic production into three categories: the educational, the entertaining, and the artistic. And he argues that Zainab is the first artistic novel, and the way I can make it. Now, on the other hand, we have Elie Kola, for example, who puts forward the argument that Zainab's canonical status as the first novel is neither based on chronological precedence nor on literary merit. He traces the development of the critical reception of Zainab across the decades of the 20th century and concludes that it was only in the Nasser's period, with the film adaptation of the novel, as well as the nationalization of university curriculum, that the novel's canonicity is enshrined. It was the convergence between the theme of the novel and Nasser's project that secured its prime position in the canon. And then, in 1999, I just mentioned another critic, Gendre also tackled this issue. And he argued that Zainab earned its status as the first Arab novel due to its influence, not its historical precedence. Its influence in curbing the traditional status of poetry, as Poole takes for granted the modernist idea of the necessity of a rupture with tradition as a prerequisite for modernity. And as such, espouses the view that since Zainab fulfills this requirement, it qualifies as the first proper expression of modernist sensibility and artistic genre. Now, critics of the modernist paradigm that privileges Western style cultural production have argued, for example, that it is not Zainab, but it is Muhammad al-Wahid al-Hadith Isa al-Hisham, published in 1907, is the first Arabic novel. Why? Because of its content, its focus on contemporary social concerns in the Arab world. In contradistinction to Zainab, whose pioneering status is based on formalistic and European genre, for example. Similarly, Rabbi Ashur has made the case for Faris al-Shujaq's Al-Saf al-Saf, published in 1855, as the first Arabic novel. She argues that al-Shujaq's literary project, which sought to renovate traditional forms and styles and emphasize continuity rather than a rupture with tradition, was marginalized by the Lobna elite because of its dissonance with their ideological choice. So, Zainab's emblematic status, I conclude, as the first Arabic novel is not based on artistic merit, nor on historical precedence, but on its amalgamation of important elements in the liberal national discourse about the modern nation. Briefly, feminist critics, on the other hand, again, obviously entered this debate, and have foregrounded the many narrative contributions by women writers, and have interpreted their marginalization as symptomatic of a patriarchal literary establishment that ignored women writers and their concerns. So, for example, novels such as Zainab Kawazi's Husn al-Awaqib, published in 1899, Labiba Hashem's Qalb al-Rasul, published in 1984, were rediscovered and presented as evidence of the existence of valuable literary contributions by women writers that predated the publication of Zainab, hence subverting the masculine domination of the literary canon. So there have been many alternatives to Zainab presented, mainly in the last 20 years. This is not Zainab dominated the scene for a very long time. However, if you look at the reasons why, for example, Labiba Hashem's novels or Zainab Kawazi's novels were excluded, whereas gender was certainly a factor in the exclusion of women from the canon, and this is something that can be discussed in the Arabic literary tradition. And it's all centered around the new writing, the Al-Gindi. So, in the 1990s, we have two debates that erupted about the literary production of a new generation of writers. The first revolved around the value of the writing from a nationalist perspective, as critics and cultural commentators negatively judged then, this generation of new writers, for not being interested in the Qadaya Kubra. I quote, this was said by a number of critics. For having relinquished the larger socio-political concerns that characterize the opus of previous generations of writers, and for focusing too much on the narrow confines of this era. Prominent writers expressed their concern for what they saw as the new generation's complete indifference to politics and culture. The debate about the Qadaya al-Kubra is linked to another debate about the artistic contribution of women writers. References to the literary production of a new generation of young women writers as academic girls writing, and qualifying some of the work under the headline of al-Sadda, writing of the Wazir, were hotly debated as indicative of hegemonic and patriarchal literary establishment. Again, the writing was deemed to be apolitical to focus on the self. Young writers, both men and women, contested these critical judgments, arguing that they were based on false dichotomies and that they consciously sought to supersede. Now, also young writers, I say right young, but the writers who emerged in the 1990s argued that the problem lies with the literary establishment that is not up to speed with new developments and has fixed tastes that originated in previous decades. For example, some writers argue that most of the critics who are now judging the new work are caught up in the styles and the moods of the 1960s and fail to decipher the specificity of the new generation, and so on and so forth. I quote here just one writer, Mustafa Zikri, who argues that contemporary Egyptian writers have abandoned the big issues that occupy the older generation. There is no longer a nation, according to him, nor are there the dramatic breakdowns and defeats, only a narrative embodying old styles. This is a genre of writing we might call existential, naked. It is of a form that belongs to the individual, that turns away from the collective, and that deals with suspicion issues of politics, history, and society. Another writer emphasized the isolation of the new generation from larger social concerns and said that yes, the new writing is the kind of literature of the ghetto, for example. So the 1990s saw a marked, so this is about Al-Qadaya al-Kubra, and translated, I mean, when we talk about Al-Qadaya al-Kubra, we're talking about national issues again, and they are the extent to which the canon is nationalistic. To go quickly to the last debate, the 1990s saw a marked increase in the number of women writers as the cultural scene leading in the cultural scene, leading to what has been described as gender equality in literary production, to use the term the words of some analysts. Now, what is new here is not the fact that women are writing, because obviously women have started writing a very long time ago, but we have an unprecedented volume of literary production by women, coinciding with an increased market interest in women's issues in local and global contexts. The high profile of creative women's presence and visibility in the literary scene triggered an aggressive backlash, driven and orchestrated by gatekeepers, I would argue, troubled by rapidly changing key players in the cultural field. The severity of the campaign launched against women writers is not dissimilar to the concerted effort to undercut the contribution of young writers of the 1990s. In this case, of course, there's a gender dimension thrown into the equation. So a long-standing controversy around the value of music literature, women's literature, feminist literature, and so on, was transformed into an effort to undermine, to be conscious or unconscious, obviously, to undermine the work of young women writers referring to the writing as embedded in Benet. The debate about women's writing escalated as the growing numbers, as I said, grew. And I'm referring here to a debate that happened. A number of articles that were published in there using words, phrases like embedded in Benet, loosely embedded in Benet, and later on in another journal, and then of course, and Benet and Loubna El-Sadda. These were terms used by prominent critics. Now, this became a debate, and many women writers engaged in this debate. Salwa El-Demerdash, a writer who started publishing in the 1990s, remarked that the word Benet, used to refer to young women writers who had seemingly an intimate manner of address, testified to, I quote, a patriarchal sense of superiority, unquote, towards younger women. She further argued that the labeling of new writing by women as a phenomenon, Zahira, is a clear indication of the hierarchical structures that the debate attempts to diminish its dominance. Writing the body is another phrase that became associated with the new generation of women writers in the 1990s and was manipulated by some critics to suggest that women writers were at the forefront of the fight against conservatism and religious fundamentalism by openly challenging cultural taboos and writing explicitly about their bodies and their sexual relationships. This seemingly liberal attitude, however, was double-edged. While outwardly championing the cause of women by foregrounding the specificity of their voice and their experience, it, to use the word of one writer and critic, became synonymous with pornographic writing, and effectively undermined the literary value of the writers in question. Now again, Salwa El-Demerdash, I go back to her, she openly challenged Ahmed Abdelmazi, prominent poet and critic and editor of Ibda', who devoted a special issue of the magazine to publish short stories by young women writers under the title El-Benet Loubna El-Sadda in Mas'asha. Ramadan does not dismiss her words and draws attention to Hegaz's prejudices and patriarchal attitude to young writers, as well as his manipulation of the prevailing ambivalence of the concept of writing the body in Arab cultural circles in such a way as to consolidate misconceptions about its meaning. Now, this is the last debate. I come to my conclusion, final word. Now, in this particular case, there's widespread consensus that the 1990s carried in new writing, and as I've tried to show, that definitions of this newness, the characteristic markers that distinguish this generation from previous ones, have been the subject of debate. A lot of critical reflection, obviously, many parties were involved, but a lot of the discussion was very much about to what extent their writing conformed to particular criteria that were deemed important in the national canon. So finally, I have tried to demonstrate the debates about Hoda El-Gindi, as well as about which novel merits the status of the first Arabic novel, are essentially ideological battles over the shape, identity, and direction of the national canon of Arabic literature, and by extension, the character and shape of the nation.
A very interesting lecture, and I'm sure a lot of us will be thinking about those debates, and possibly we can be making use of them in our own research. So I think if we have any questions for Dr. Hoda El-Sadda, all right, here's a question. All right.
Thank you for the interesting book. I have a few questions. One concerns you mentioned the book that this book is coming out of, and I'm curious to know the title of the book and where it is going to be published from. And also, I was wondering if by surveying the mechanics of canon formation and in the construction of the canon for Arabic literature for the novel, you were focusing mostly on region, or you are also the presence of women critics has or has not controlled the presence of lack of presence of women critics have contributed to this idea of transformation. Finally, if translation has also contributed, because recently we know that translation has played a great role in forming the canon of Arabic literature, especially in Western education institutions.
Thank you very much. So the book is called Gendre in Arabic Novel. It's coming out in 2 weeks, inshallah, and it's published by, it's called Gendre in Arabic Novel. It's in English, and it's published by Cecil and El-Demerdash. So this is a usually focus, yes, and actually this is one of the things I like to do. And I for 2 reasons basically. What I do is to be able to follow the debates in depth, I try to focus on Egypt. But I argue 2 things, that a lot of the arguments actually apply to other contexts, right? But also that Egypt is a logical side to focus on. Why? Because all of these debates originated in Egypt. Alright? So in a sense, historically, all of these issues about donation and counterfeit, these are all debates that actually originated in Egypt. And then we can talk about how they became part of other contexts and so on. But I think that it's, and then of course there are a lot of, and now, I mean, if you follow the new directions in literature, there's a lot of emphasis now on differences between countries. I personally find it exaggerated, to be honest, but there is this attempt to try and think of characteristics of the material. So, in that sense, also, I decided to focus on Egypt to make it easier, in fact, for me to develop my argument historically, because I try to develop it historically. Women critics, yes, definitely. Women critics play a very important role in identifying women writers and shedding light on their work. And this is absolutely true. You'll find that most of the critical literature that has discovered Aisha or Zerfa and so on, these are all women critics. So definitely, and this is very much in the tradition of Western feminist critics and also black critics, like focusing on works by African American writers, for example. So this is very much part of the rediscovery of marginalized voices in literature in the Arab world and other places. That's true. Is translation important? Translation is a big issue. I think you're absolutely right. Translation